Welcome you to the first afternoon panel. And I'm Professor Jane Stromseth here at Georgetown University Law Center. I'd like to say a special thank you to the Dash family and to the sponsors and co-sponsors of this event for making it possible. It's been a terrific discussion so far, and we hope we can live up to the high standards set by the morning speakers and the lunch speaker. Our panel is entitled The Institutional Approach to the Rule of Law. Whose job is it anyway? And a number of questions that we hope our panelists will touch upon, including how should we understand the rule of law and what should be the goals and objectives of post-conflict rule of law building? What kinds of methods of rule of law building have been effective in the past? To what extent should the military be doing this work? What specific roles is the military particularly good at? Or should civilians be primarily doing the work of building the rule of law? And if that's the case, do the civilian agencies have adequate capacity to do this work, particularly in very difficult security settings? How should U.S. agencies be organized internally to more effectively coordinate and carry out rule of law work? How much rule of law work should U.S. agencies and departments do directly, or to what extent should they rely on NGOs and contractors? What about better coordination with multilateral actors, the UN, organizations such as the World Bank, and NGOs? How effective has civil-military coordination been in the past, and how could it be done better in the future? These are just some of the larger issues that we'll be touching upon in our panel. And fortunately, we have a terrific group of panelists with wide-ranging experience in the rule of law. And I'm just going to briefly introduce them. You have their full bios in your materials. So let me just highlight a few things, and then we'll get on to our discussion. Brigadier General Edward Cardon is Deputy Commandant of the Commandant General Staff College, Combined Arms Center, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And in his long and distinguished career, he has served in many different missions, many of them with a rule of law component. For example, he served as Chief Geographic Officer for I4S4 in Bosnia-Herzegovina, as well as Chief of the Initiatives Group for the Commander Stabilization Forces S4. He's had 3 tours in Iraq in different roles, including as commander of the 4th Brigade Combat Team, 3rd Infantry Division, as Deputy Commanding General Support for Multinational Division Center, and as Deputy Commanding General Support for the 3rd Infantry Division. So he brings terrific experience to bear, and he's trained as an engineer, I should say. So he has a lot of valuable experience and perspective from that professional background as well. Chris Homan is the Foreign Policy Advisor for Senator Richard Durbin. And previously, he was Director for Iraq Programs at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, NDI, and he's had more than a decade of foreign policy and international development experience in all regions of the world. And I should add, echoing some of our earlier discussion in the morning, he's served as a city council member in Southern Maryland, so he's had some practical grassroots rule of law experience, and he's also taught in both the United States and Africa. Rachel Kleinfeld, our third speaker, is the co-founder and executive director of the Truman National Security Project. She has extensive experience as a consultant on national security and rule of law matters. She's consulted, for example, to organizations such as the World Bank and the Open Society Institute. She's a regular writer and speaker on the rule of law and has published a number of highly regarded, thoughtful pieces on the rule of law and how to think about it and how to define and understand it. Joanna Mendelson Foreman is a senior associate with the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. She's a former co-director of the Post-Conflict Reconstruction Project. She's written extensively on security sector reform in conflict states, economic development in post-war societies, and the role of the UN in peace operations. She participated in a CSIS team that was involved in a post-conflict reconstruction review of the work of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. She has extensive experience in the U.S. government, including at the Agency for International Development, and she also served as an advisor to the UN mission in Haiti. So you can see on this panel we have an enormous array of expertise, both in the United States government, in the military, in consulting, in working for different organizations on building the rule of law. And I've asked each of the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes, at which point we'll be happy to open it up for discussion. So we'll start with General Cardon.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the Dash family in Georgetown for setting up this relevant and very essential program. And it's also great to see a lot of old friends here. Let me jump in and just answer this question: whose job is it anyways? And I'll describe it like this: everyone has a role to play. And what I mean by that is there's a science to this that matters. Security enables civilian capacity. You take away the security, and the security situation's bad, then there is no civilian capacity to put forth. But the art of it matters also. The design, plan, execution, it's not a static script, but it has opportunities and vulnerabilities. And while today Tom Ricks talked a lot about the U.S. side, there were a lot of things that happened on the Iraqi side as well that enabled the surge. People forget that Maliki was elected by one vote in the Council of Representatives, that the Shia Muqtada al-Sadr announced a ceasefire on August 27th. Those contributed to the rule of law that allowed the stabilization that allowed this progress to occur. My talk is informed by 3 tours. I was there in 2003, 2005, and then the surge 2007, 2008. So start off where you're leading a task force, and you're one of the first units in central Baghdad in 2003. Civil order is collapsing, the government's collapse, and while the military footprint is just in thousands, the population's in millions. Challenges quickly shifted from the military action to what we now call stability operations, and the rule of law collapsed. And so what do we do now? Knowing what we know now, we could have done this a lot better. One of the keys to stability operations is to establish or reestablish this rule of law, and I describe this in 4 functions: the law, security forces, the courts, and the prisons. First, the law itself. Iraq has a long history of law with its Hammurabi tradition that's thousands of years old. And when the CPA came in and imposed its law, it wasn't always seen as legitimate. Even the COR today, with its list system and the way that people were elected, with the boycotts by the Sunnis, many out in the provinces do not see the laws that are passed by the COR today as legitimate. I attribute many of our initial challenges to the poor understanding of the cultures down at the lowest level. Saddam had destroyed the rule of law to the point that traditionally tribal law, Sharia law, common law, commercial law, all of this was in a state of flux at a very local level. As the jubilation in 2003 changed to concern and then fear, survival became a daily struggle, and that brings out both the best and worst in people. Some would say the law then became to the definition by the point of a gun. And how did this affect stability? Well, for a long time, the military considers criminal activity outside of its purview. Murders, kidnappings, theft. It's only when we shifted our mindset to the control of the population and population control that we really got interested in the rule of law. Now, criminals actually strive for instability, and when captured, now we have to process them in a legal framework. And now, all of a sudden, exploitation and prosecution becomes much more important than capturing them. The next challenge was the growth of security forces, and we're still working on this after almost 6 years. While I've seen huge improvements since we started in 2003, we have a lot of work to do, but it's not all military. For example, it's now 2005. You've been given the task to build Iraqi security force capacity as fast as possible. And as part of the January 2005 elections, units were stood up very rapidly, units that we now know today as Special Police Commandos. These forces kept the peace, that's true, but they used this position to advance their very sectarian agenda, creating legitimacy problems and the problems of the rule of law. The security forces then became part of the problem. And if they're part of the problem used with illegitimate authority, then the very tool that we use to uphold the security apparatus now directly works against the advancement of the rule of law. These vestiges and fears with the role of the police. And a reminder, prior to 2003, Saddam kept power through the police, so the police are feared. The infiltration of the police by militias and insurgents, the slow growth and resourcing all contribute to a lack of capacity, which directly affected the security situation. For example, when my brigade took over its area in 2005, there were only 4 police stations left in an area of 1.2 million people, and 3 of those 4 were attacked by car bombs while we were there. They did all survive, thank goodness. We still struggle with this police, and even when we left in June 2008 on this last tour, only 1/3 of the police had transition team coverage. We heard some talk today about the IPLOs. I'll tell you that talent does matter. The wrong person at the wrong place with the wrong skills is not helpful at all in these sort of operations. Next, the courts. 2003, no involvement, and 2005, only with the Iraqi or with the Central Criminal Court of Iraq. But in 2007, 2008, extensive involvement with both the judges and the courts. Met with the provincial judges on a regular basis. But the mechanism to do this is what I think is the greatest invention, which is the provincial reconstruction teams. Properly structured, they're equal to battalions of combat power on the ground. The challenge is the civilian capacity for these is still growing. Some are very big, some never got above 3 people. Finally, the prisons. In 2005, we did find an illegal detention facility in our area with Iraqi warrants, but they certainly lack oversight, training, and resourcing. This makes all of these institutions ripe for corruption, lack of due process, sectarian strife, and just plain inefficiency. And these all impact legitimacy. And we also struggled with our own facilities in the beginning with a fair process. It's one thing just to capture people, but then to actually prosecute them so they're not on the streets within 14 days is a big problem. I'd argue next time we better figure out in advance of the intervention rather than develop our program over time like we've done, because no matter what happens, whatever we do sets a precedent. So here's where we are today. We've relearned a lot of past lessons, spent a lot of money and blood, and we've learned some new lessons. We've learned that the principle of legitimacy impacts every aspect of stability operations from every conceivable perspective, and this is directly linked to the rule of law. Getting this right is the equivalent of brigades of combat power. Legitimacy impacts every aspect of our operations, and if we get this right early, before we begin, it takes time off the clock. We have to have a comprehensive approach. The idea of provincial reconstruction teams, a combination of military and civilian, and if possible, interagency is critically important. One sure sign of a viable and recognized rule of law process is to have one for the host nation and intervening force in advance. Exploitation and prosecution of target persons. We're just not going to be able to capture or kill our way out of these. It's about legitimacy, legitimate host nation security forces with a fair and impartial manner, how that's all being watched. It's the manner in which we capture and detain them. It's how we interrogate them. It's how we hold them. It's how we rehabilitate, incarcerate, or reconcile them. So the real challenge is adapt, improve, and innovate every day. So what have we done to the Army? Well, we've changed the way we train. We changed our leader development education system, and we continue to adapt and learn. We're still working to integrate the whole of government with itself. We have some counterinsurgency manuals now, both in the military and the civilian side. We're working hard with the selection, education, and training of people, and I know the State Department and us are both working together. For example, in the Command and General Staff College now, there are more and more interagency coming. We'll have about 30 this next year that will go through the entire course with our majors, and we have provided an equivalent number of majors to go to those departments to replace them, which allows them to free those up. By the way, we'll take 96, so we'll take as many as we can get. We have to continue to collaborate for a different mindset of where we educate, train, and gain experience together with the trust, collaboration, cooperation that will continue. Finally, it takes a long time to change the Army, but I think we've come a long way since 2003. It's not easy, it's hard, and it takes a lot of effort to change the mindset of the Army. I think Tom Ricks talked about that today. It's especially important when the deeds and actions of every individual soldier and civilian are so important. And we're not done. We live in a dynamic environment. So it's a continuous effort to examine the nature and character of the war we're in and to be ready for the opportunity. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. I look forward to your questions. Well,
thank you also for having me. This is a bit of history. So most of my time or career has been in the development world, working with the National Democratic Institute, where we worked to build democratic institutions long term. So many of my comments will come from that experience. My last few years at NDI, we're working on the Iraq program, which included constitutional reform or development in Iraq. While I work for Senator Durbin right now, I want to also point out my comments are not reflective of his officially, although I do hope to make some plugs for some of his ideas and legislation. So I think the timing of this debate couldn't be better. We have two huge military engagements right now, one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan. And the need for building the basic democratic institutions in these countries couldn't be larger, couldn't be more stark, including the rule of law, which I will speak more broad, kind of lump rule of law with the development, democratic development together. So I think in both of these cases, the military was initially asked or perhaps forced to take on many of the traditionally civilian development roles. I think in some cases this may have been seen as a role that they were well suited to do. In other cases it may have been a turf issue. In others, a reality of the security situation. Also, it could have been because of insufficient civilian experts to start, or I would argue in part, or maybe largely, it was because there was no planning done whatsoever for the civilian period after the initial military action. And I think that's tragic, and I think that was disrespectful to the military effort. So this debate, what is the military's role in rebuilding government institutions or democratic institutions in failed states, is an important and a healthy debate to have. Just this week, the House Foreign Affairs Committee had a hearing on exactly this issue, on our smart power capabilities. Retired Marine General Hagee noted that we must have an integrated blend of defense, diplomacy, and development, and I think that's exactly it. Secretary Gates, former Secretary Rice, current Secretary Clinton, they've all echoed the same theme, and I believe I heard you say it as well. So what is that correct balance then? I think the military should do what it does best, fighting wars and securing the peace. There's definitely a role for engaging with local and national officials. There's a role for training and supporting security officials, strengthening military justice and detention facilities, civil military training, for example, what our Defense Institute of International Legal Studies does, and definitely a role for supporting the larger civilian effort. Iraq is an example where, through the PRTs, some civilian work was done. So while in Iraq and Afghanistan, I would argue the military performed exceptionally, it was unrealistic to expect them to be involved in what I would argue is a 10 or 20-year process of rebuilding basic governing institutions. It's just unrealistic. Long-term governing institution building parliaments, civil society, political parties, judicial systems, this is a civilian-led effort, and to ask the military to do that is not only unfair, but I think an excessive burden for them to carry. So why then? Why is the civilian better placed to do this, the civilian effort? Well, as I mentioned, this is long-term work. It's often not very glamorous. For example, in Eastern Europe, we're still there doing nuts and bolts democracy work 2 decades after the Soviet Union collapsed. A lot of this work is very specialized. It can be requires patience and perseverance. Their best practices shared from other countries that have gone through other examples. Their exchanges of parliamentarians and civic leaders to learn how to govern and how to be a judge, for example. And I think NGOs and civilian agencies such as USAID probably have the best expertise to commit to doing this and to address over the long haul. If I give you I can give you an example from the Iraqi constitutional process. We brought in constitutional experts from all over the world, different countries who'd wrestled with the federal structure and where you draw the power lines. I see some of my friends who wrestled with this. What is the line for church or mosque and state? This requires a whole network of international experts and practitioners who can do this and sit and talk with their counterparts. You don't want to tie up the military's time doing this over the long haul. Ultimately, though, I think this should be what we should strive for, is a coherent partnership of all our U.S. foreign policy tools, the military, the civilian, and the diplomatic branches. But part of the problem has been that we have decimated our country's premier development agency, USAID. In the 60s, USAID had 5,000 Foreign Service officers. Anyone want to take a guess how many we have today? We're fighting 2 major wars. We recognize the threat of failed states. We have 1,000 or so. It's tragic. A few years ago when Senator Durbin and I went to Afghanistan, a country wrestling with poppy production and traditionally an agricultural nation, how many agricultural civilian experts did the U.S. have there? 6. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. The military can't solve this, and we don't have the civilian resources to address it. And without the civilian resources, I think that jeopardizes all the hard work of what the military does on the front end. You can't secure the long-term peace without the long-term civilian engagement. And here's a plug for a Durbin bill. I will point out, on the USAID front, Durbin has a bill to triple USAID's foreign service officers over the next 3 years. We've been pushing this in the Senate. I think it's part of a larger effort that we should look at reforming our whole foreign assistance work, where it needs to have a greater status in the White House, it needs to be coordinated better, and it needs to be ready to go if we have these kinds of situations such as Iraq or Afghanistan. So I would conclude where I hit in the middle a while ago that there is a role for all these different agencies, but we need to strengthen the civilian side, and it needs to be coordinated better.
Terrific. Well, I'm glad we were just talking about arm wrestling up here with who got to go first, since we thought we were all going to say the same thing, but I'm happy that's not going to happen. First, thanks to the Dash family. This is just a phenomenal opportunity, and it's a real honor to be up here. And thank you, Rosa and Georgetown, for having this, and Jane for putting us all together. So I'm really been enjoying the day. I want to break my talk into 2 sections, ideal versus reality. And within that, talk a little bit on a broader level about what is the rule of law, what is the ideal, and where does the military play in that, and then what is the reality, what are the institutions that we need to affect, and where does the military play within that sandbox. So to start with, what is the core of the rule of law? There's 2 ways of breaking it down. Colonel Cardon broke it down in an institutional framework. There are laws, there are institutions, there's the judiciary, there's the police, there's the prisons. And that's a very matter-of-fact way when you walk into a new situation. How do you break it down? You look at those institutions. The other way to break it down is the way that the ancient Greeks did, and the way it happens much more in jurisprudential literature. And this is, what's our end goal? What are we trying to do when we're building the rule of law? And this looks at things like law and order, equality before the law, human rights, a government that obeys the law, that follows the law, and the settlement of disputes. So those are the ends that you're trying to achieve through the rule of law. If you're looking at it through that vein, what's the role of the military? Well, you immediately see that there's a problem simply because the military is in uniform. So take away the reality of what the military actually does. If the goal of the rule of law is about getting a government to be subordinate to law, getting local oligarchs or getting local leaders of various sorts and nefarious sorts. My background is in Albania and Indonesia rather than Iraq and Afghanistan, so lots of organized crime issues and military issues on another footing. If you're trying to get them subordinate to law, but the military is the organ that's doing it, which in itself is now not acting subordinate to a civilian within that context, within the Iraq context or the Afghanistan context, well, you're confusing the situation. And that's the major problem with the military being the face of rule of law building, even if every single thing that the military is doing is exactly what you would want to have happen. That face alone causes problems with the overarching issue. So in your ideal situation, your civilians are doing the work, exactly what Chris said. In your ideal situation, the military is solving the security issues. The civilians come in. At that point, the military provides protection. They might provide witness protection. They might provide judicial protection. They're providing protection certainly for the aid workers and the civilian and the NGO workers. The military will be heading off problems. They'll be trying to stop looting before looting exists. Every single after-action report of every single military engagement we've had talks about looting as a problem right after the government falls. It's a big problem afterward for rule of law. You want to head off problems in the property sphere. If you're seeing that lots of homes are being overtaken by different populations, and you can head that off ahead of time, you save the courts and the rule of law system a lot of problems on the back end, dealing with getting the right house back to the right person. And you want to head off disputes at the local level by working with the local village sheikhs or the local village tribal leaders to help them settle disputes before those disputes go into the legal system, which is, by definition, in a post-conflict situation, weak and somewhat broken and so on. And the more you can solve through common sense, the better. And then you'd want to model equality under the law. This is a huge issue in a lot of these countries where there's been authoritarian government of one sort or another, that the government is above the law, and often the military is above the law, in a country like Indonesia, certainly, a country like Iraq as well. And so the more the military models that, shows that through its own actions, that you're subordinate to a civilian structure, you're subordinate to a legal structure, the more you show that guns alone don't rule. That's the ideal, and that would be plenty of work for the military to do within that situation of civilian leadership. The reality, however, is what's post-conflict. At what point do we get to a post-conflict situation in the wars that we're in right now? I was in Afghanistan in May. There was a suicide bombing as I was going up the steps to my airplane, right outside the airport in Kabul. It's been a couple years that we've been in Afghanistan. Last time I checked, it's not post-conflict yet. Neither is Iraq. Neither are most of our current wartime situations. So when do the civilians get to come? When is it safe enough for them to leave Kabul, to leave the green zone, to get out and do the work that they need to do? We were hearing earlier about the $8,000 a day cost of security, and often that security is somewhat subpar in some of these countries. I'm not speaking of Iraq, but I certainly know in Afghanistan. It's very difficult to know at what point civilians are going to come in on their white horse to solve the situation, even though they're the group that should. And so in that mixed-up situation where you have your PRTs that are partially civilian, partially military, when you have your civilian NGO workers on the ground, whether you want them there or not as the military because you're babysitting and taking care of them, as well as hoping that they do the work, when you're in this spaghetti situation of so many folks on the ground, the military is going to have a role, and the military is going to fill a lot of vacuums. And what should you do? Well, the first is to admit that you're not the right player to be doing it. And I think just the fact that you can admit that, just the fact that you can say, you know, really, this should be a civilian mission. I shouldn't be up here in my uniform teaching police. Just what Phil Carter was saying earlier, that's not the proper role. That goes a long way toward the modeling of what should be the proper role. Everyone understands the difference between ideal and reality, and it goes a long way toward showing that you understand that the rule of law is not about military leadership. Once you've done that, you can focus on the core problems. As long as you're there and you're doing it, let's make sure it's being done right. There's two ways to cut at the core problems. One way is to go again to those ends, you know, human rights and equality under the law and so on. What's the one that you're best able to affect? Well, there's probably two in most post-conflict situations that really matter. One is security. Just as we were hearing earlier, security is the job par excellence. Nothing happens without security on the ground. Security is the currency in most of these countries. And to the extent you can provide security, you're securing the role for the rule of law. But security is so much more than the police and even the prisons. If you think about a police force in Baltimore, a police force in New Orleans, and other tough cities in the States, what do the police spend a lot of their time doing? When I worked with the police in New Haven, we spent a lot of time doing gang work. We spent a lot of time doing vocational education. Can we get these guys who should be learning a job, learning a trade, into a trade so that they're not selling drugs on the street? Spend a lot of time doing after-work patrols or after-school patrols, because it's the 17-year-olds coming out of school that are causing a lot of the crime. It's not a whole heck of a lot different in an insurgency sort of a situation. Obviously, the stakes are much different. But a lot of the rule of law issues are similar. Jobs. That's a huge security issue. To the extent that the military is doing things that gets the economy rolling, you're affecting the security situation. Are people able to go to school, to university, to further their future? That's part of the security situation. So when you're focused on that end goal of security, you're looking at it more holistically than prisons, police, etc. The second is abuse. The basic goal of the rule of law is to reset a relationship between the society and the state. That's what the rule of law is all about. And if you're creating a relationship between the state and society that's based on law, that's based on a government subordinate to law, then it's absolutely essential that you don't allow abuse to enter your situation in which you're in control. So this is, are you letting a warlord be the face of your operation in your area? Are you contracted out to a local Iraqi policeman who is well known for committing human rights abuse? This sort of thing goes on. It's common, it's problematic, and it undermines the whole rule of law mission. And so there's a lot you can do by focusing on security writ large and your role in showing that abuse is not the way that state and society function together. And on the security issue, I should say, this gets to coin. Not every war is going to be a coin sort of a war, but it's about population-centric rather than enemy-centric focus when you're thinking about the security issue. The last thing is what are your means? And this is, I'm not a lawyer in the rule of law field, and there's a lot of lawyers in the rule of law field, and when lawyers look at the rule of law, they tend to look at law. When judges look at the rule of law, they tend to look at the judiciary. I tend to see it as having 4 different areas: laws, institutions, politics, and culture. And it's those latter 2 that are the key to the rule of law. There's lots of countries that dispense law under big banyan trees. There's lots of countries that dispense law with oral law traditions, with not written law traditions. There's the common law and the civil law, and both have changed for many, many years, over many, many centuries. The politics and the culture of the rule of law, however, are crucial across any country. And so when you're looking at the rule of law, it's really important to keep in mind that it's primarily a political issue. Who has the power? How are they going to share it? What are the processes by which they share it and exercise power? And does the culture accept that rule of law ideal? Is the culture a blood vendetta culture? In Albania, it certainly was. Getting folks to think that, no, they have to turn in their disputes to the state took a lot of cultural change. If you're focused on the laws and institutions to the detriment or to the absence of the politics and culture, you're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Any political leader can change those laws and institutions. Any culture can ignore them altogether. So keep your eye on the ball as you're doing the work about what really matters. And finally, I would say muddle through. It's a really, really big job. We really aren't in the business of rebuilding states, and now we're in the business of rebuilding 2. And while I wish that we had a whole of government that was behind you, and we're trying to get there, Senator Durbin is doing a good job trying to get there. Until we do, I think you all are doing a tremendous job, and to the extent we can be of help, it's a privilege to be.
Well, thank you to all of my fellow panelists for setting such a rich table for me to try and finish the conversation. Also, thank you to both Rosa Brooks and Jane for having me here and to the Georgetown University Law School for inviting me to a conference whose name follows one of my heroes. When I was studying law, I always remember the work of Mr. Dash. It was during the time I was in law school, and I always thought, I wanted to do something in relationship to this field, and I wound up as I guess, what do you call it, a lawyer who no longer practices but does spend a lot of time thinking about how the things that we learn in our education apply to these various difficult environments. I was struck today, and I just got back from, one more assessment of post-conflict areas or conflictive areas. I was recently in Colombia with the headlines in today's paper that said, "Civilians to join Afghan buildup," and the story talked about the surge of civilian workers workers in Afghanistan. And it's talked about, this is a welcome acknowledgement, I'll quote, that internal conflicts require a balance of military might and civilian capacity. And when I read that, I said, how did they know I was going to speak at this conference this morning? They're so prescient in the New York Times. But the answer is really perhaps almost commonplace by now. I think the comments of both General Cardon and also my colleagues Chris and Rachel reaffirm that we all know what we need to do. We just haven't gotten there yet. And I think there are some basics to not repeating what people have said. But as we move into the Obama era, I would like to look forward and think about the pledge that President Obama made to improve civil-military balance in U.S. operations and to put a more civilian face on the development and governance efforts is truly being hampered, not so much by the will of our military that has worked long and hard in securing the peace in some of the most difficult parts of the world, but by the problems in our own system, the institutional disharmony, the problems of the way we are organized as a government that still have not been remedied. Now, I think unlike some of my colleagues here, I've been in this business a long time. I helped start the Office of Transition Initiatives with 3 human beings who were supposed to take on the world. I worked for the World Bank when they first started their post-conflict unit, and you couldn't mention the S word, a security word, in the corridors, but we had all the money, and I remember people coming to ask us for help with support for police cars. I worked at the UN, which is, for anybody who's worked at the UN, they know the difficulties of trying to use a multilateral instrument to win the peace, but yet all of these institutions bring something to the table, and they do so in the spirit of trying to support our military objectives. And I think that's where we're having a problem, not so much because the military objectives are unclear, but because the resourcing of the civilian side of the equation has never become a priority. We have the most asymmetric relationship between the accounts that support our military and the accounts that support our civilians. I think the ratio, last I looked, between the two accounts was 20-1, and this is not saying that our Defense Department doesn't need this resourcing. We certainly do, fighting 2 wars, but we certainly need to give a comparative advantage to the people who know best how to do these democracy and governance components. So I just make a plea for that right now, that we're dealing with an asymmetry of resources, and I learned a long time ago working for a wonderful General, Gordon Sullivan, when I was a fellow to him, that you can do any job if you have the armed forces because they're on duty 24 hours a day and they'll do whatever you ask, and that's true, but that's not the purpose of what we're trying to achieve in the rule of law. Our instruments are very, very limited right now. And in order to implement some of the most novel ideas, the Civilian Reserve Corps, which finally has legislative authority and some resources behind it, if you look at the 500 people that have been discussed to be part of this new civilian reserve, I think only about 30 of them will be police, and the rest will be in other areas. And what are the things we need most in conflict areas? We need police. We need police to prevent riots. We need police to interact with civilians. These are the kinds of things that are key. When I was doing this work in the late 1990s, we always had the lie of the 1990s was interagency coordination. And I hate to break the news that the lie is still interagency coordination, because everybody goes to meetings and says, yes, we're ready, we can do this, and then when you get back to your office, there's no resources, no personnel, we have no contracting facility. I do remember a wonderful scene. We were getting ready literally to do the invasion of Haiti, and all of us were seated at the table in the Pentagon, and I remember General Clark was there, and he said, are you ready? And all the U.S. aid agencies and all the Justice Department agencies and everybody said, oh, yes, we're ready. And then everybody got back out in the hall and said, what are we going to do? So the answer is, fortunately, Haiti was not as hard as Iraq, but it's still ongoing for a variety of reasons, which we know relate to the context of conflict resolution, the context of rebuilding, that you can't think of things in 5-year terms, and yet our budgets work in 1 year and sometimes 5-year terms. So let me say, what do we have in our toolkit now? We have a lot of wonderful tools to work with. In addition to our military, we have a coordinator for stability operations. We have have the Justice Department's ISITOP, which is supposed to train police. We have USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives, and they've even started an Office of Military Affairs, something that if you mentioned, by the way, in the 1990s, if you use the security sector reform word in AID, they put you in the corner with a dunce hat on. But there is now no one-stop shopping except our Department of Defense and our armed forces, and that's part of the problem. And with all due respect to our Congress, which has tried hard, there have been many dedicated members trying to get this changed, I think we have not made as much progress as we think we had, except in thinking. We are great thinkers. I have been to more conferences with wonderful thinkers about how to correct this in the last decade. I mean, I could, recite every one of them. And I think the learning is there, and that's what's so frustrating to me. I am an academic first and then a practitioner, is that when we have this learning, why are we not able to implement what we know? Why can't we support the people in uniform who are doing the hardest job in the world by giving them the natural complement of civilian authority? That is what I don't understand. And I don't understand it because we have smart men and women in Congress, and I don't understand it because we have plenty of people in this room and outside this room who know how difficult it is to do this work in the field. Now, I started my career doing civil-military relations in Latin America, and I cut my teeth working down at South Common, working with some of the not the nicest people in the world who ran these countries. And one thing that we did learn out of the lessons of the 1990s and the 80s of these military officers and soldiers was that militaries couldn't run everything. The failure of regimes in many of these countries was truly the fact that they weren't businessmen and they couldn't run governments, and the success of democratization in one part of the world is really a function of the tremendous dedication of the civilian capacity of the United States to help support these institutions. It's truly a lesson in the way you apply resources and have a success. I think we can do the same in other parts of the world. But let me just say that we need to do it with adequate resources. We need to do it with adequate legislative authorities. Before this session, I was chatting with our colleagues here that Section 660 of the Foreign Assistance Act, which creates a problem in police training for civilians, still is on the books. And while there are probably more waivers that probably make up big, thick volumes of this section, why we can't get over this problem that started in the 1960s, we're now in 2009, still baffles me. We are in need of training police. We're in need of training legal officers, and yet that is still a problem. And it all will be changed if we change our Foreign Relations Act. We are still operating under legislative authorities that were created to win the Cold War, which we won, but that's been almost 20 years now. And we need to change those so that the talent and capacity of our civilian structures can work in complement. Let me just add one other thing, because I don't want to take up time and give you the alphabet soup of all the agencies which are involved in it, but let me say one thing. We suffered in the last 8 years by U.S. exceptionalism, not working with international and multilateral bodies to help support our mission. Our civilian capacity could have been multiplied many times over had we accepted the support of the United Nations, had we accepted the support of some of the European countries in trying to enhance the civilian capacities. It wasn't for want of trying, but in fact, I think the most promising aspect we face down the road is a return to acceptance of working with partners. The United States government cannot do it alone. We particularly can't do it alone in a financial crisis that is pulling resources from every single account in the United States government. And we are going to have to face a world where we are also working in partnership, not only with other governments, but with other institutions, to make sure that our military has the best support possible to help them secure peace in many of these areas. I think we're getting closer to achieve it. I wouldn't want to close on a note by saying we're not there, because we certainly have had progress in thinking of how to do this. But I do feel we're at the starting line and the gun is ready to go off, but we're going to need a lot more and a lot faster in order to achieve this. One last military observation, and I'd be interested to hear what the general thinks of that. It always seems we plan our wars fighting the last war. I don't know if we'll ever have another Iraq and Afghanistan after this experience, but I certainly think the planning that's been going on now is based on the past experiences we've over the last 5 to 8 years. And I think there will be other conventional types of threats that may once again divert our forces to do more kinetic activities, to be less engaged in this broader stability operations, despite the beauty of the Field Manual 307, which I really like and, used our post-conflict report gratefully. But I just wonder, and I leave this as a question, whether in fact transferring all these positions to the military as a default necessarily gives us the benefit and the protection we need for future wars. So I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you.
I think, as predicted, this was a terrifically rich discussion, and I would like to, before we open to the audience, give the panelists a chance to just respond, because there were some questions posed between the panelists. I think a question for the General, perhaps a question to Chris about why isn't Congress doing more to help build up civilian capacity? You have to answer that question, yes. So I'm going to give each of the panelists a chance to say a brief word of response, and then I'll open it up to the audience.
Well, very quickly on the question there in the end, I think the military's realized we can get in pretty quick. We can't get out. And that is the problem. And we have realized that we're not going to get out without civilian capacity. We are not that trustful. That may be the wrong word, but the problem with the United Nations and the EU and the World Bank, and I've met with them several times in Baghdad, is they always want to have a five-year plan, and I need a 5-day plan. I come in, I got to hire 500 people. I want to get them off the streets by next week, and there's no system to do that. And eventually, it's like, okay, we'll just do this ourselves, figure out how to do it, and that's what we do. And that may not even be. It may meet short-term interest, but not the long-term interest. And I think it's because we come in, I echo what Rachel said, jobs is critical. I mean, if we come in knowing that we're going to have employment conservatively for 1 million people, which is probably about right for Iraq, then we ought to think about that early on, and then how do we develop the structures to do that? But it's always haphazard. But I would say the reason is we know now we can't get out of these situations without. And so there's 307 and 30 both. Those new manuals are a way to kind of speed this along.
Why can't Congress solve this? Well, I would say that in the last few years there does seem to be more both bipartisan awareness, recognition, and support that the civilian development sides of our international efforts of our government need to be strengthened, that they're critical to our security and stabilizing countries overseas. There was a hearing on this last year, and I've never seen so many people standing in line for a congressional hearing on foreign assistance. That was something. Why hasn't that happened? Well, I think Congressman Berman has indicated on the House side that he would like to do a large foreign assistance reform, but you have issues of turf. There are limited funds. There is the question, are we going to spend money on international engagement when our own economy is struggling? And all of these have to be resolved. So what you have now is a very limited foreign assistance budget compared to the overall U.S. government budget. I think it's a paltry amount, especially compared to other Western countries. And it's like squeezing a balloon. We're arguing every year. Durbin is on the Foreign Operations Subcommittee that funds a lot of this. And we're arguing over a few million here and a few million there for global health or foreign military assistance. It's a ridiculous way of getting things done when these larger systemic problems are there. President Obama has, in the budget he submitted a few weeks ago, requested a 10% increase in the foreign assistance, foreign affairs budget, which is a good jump. We'll have to see if that survives the budget process on the Hill. But can I mention one thing that you touched upon? It deals with how do you have civilians go into a post-conflict situation when it's still unstable? And so we wrestled with this a lot at NDI. Do we work out of PRTs or not? And in some of these countries where there's a lot of mistrust, the PRTs are seen as just another arm of the U.S. government or the U.S. military, and the public, women leaders, civil society leaders, youth leaders, are very nervous or hesitant to go work out of one of these. And yet civilian development experts can't really work in these parts of the community unless you're in a PRT. What do you do? I don't think we've answered that sufficiently as a community here.
I think poor Chris here is just going to get more loaded upon him. I just wanted to say that Joanna's point about Section 660, for those of you who don't know, within that Foreign Aid Act, there's 28 agencies and sub-agencies that deal with the rule of law on the civilian side. 28. It's a lot. And then there's laws within that, and then a whole host of waivers that say that military can't train police, and then the military can train police, but only under these circumstances. And what we've ended up with is, in order to keep ourselves from training police that commit human rights abuses abroad, are rules for ICITAP, the Civilian Police Training Organization, that practically force that organization to do poor police training, and that's caused by Congress. Now, they do the best they can, but they're allowed to train for a month at a time and no more than a month, and set courses that are pre-approved, so they can't really adapt to the situation on the ground. And certainly on the ground, they try to get around some of these things, but that was all set up in the 70s in order to avoid us creating human rights abuse problems. And the reality is, we're not good at police training, and we're seeing that reality in Afghanistan. We're also seeing it in Iraq, but right now we're really seeing it in Afghanistan. And those kinds of cleanups to the legislation don't cost any money. They do cost some real thought, and they cost some political chips.
Well, I do say, and I didn't want to leave the impression that things hadn't moved, because they have moved. And there has been a sense certainly within the Agency for International Development, a feeling that they have to address conflict. Their programming is involved in it. They realize that their democracy and governance work has to expand, that it has to be supportive. But I think the challenge, aside from the legislative impediments, which none of us can chair unless we all are elected into our respective districts, is that we need to figure out a way to support exactly what the General has referred to. When you need things immediately, they have to be there because they're part of the security package. But I do think that adequate planning could also help, overcome some of these obstacles, working with the Europeans or working with the UN, not because they're unwilling partners, but because they, like us, have the same kinds of legislative and legal impediments that they have to operate with as well. And that's where we need not so much a whole of government, but a whole of world approach when we have to deal with stability operations that would integrate the different forces. Now, I think there is some silliness going on also. I was just at a conference in Wilton Park where some of the European colleagues of mine says, well, we'll go into PRTs, but we won't do any shooting. I mean, this is kind of a silly phenomena where we'll only do the cleanup, but we won't do the military work. That's not an appropriate approach either. But I do think some of these obstacles could be overcome if we really sat down and determined how we are going to operate and use the global resources that are available to us, because 500 people in a civilian reserve corps is not going to touch the needs that we're talking about in the short run.
Great. Thank you. There was someone in the back who stood up initially. Yes, go ahead.
Hi,
Milan.
I'm the Senior Rule of Law Advisor at the Secretary of State's Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization. And I just wanted to refine your comment on the Civilian Response Corps. I'm not going to go in depth on it, but in brief, it's the U.S. government's response to some of the gaps and lessons learned revealed in past engagements, and it has been funded now to start up with a group of 100 active and 500 standby. In terms of the number of police advisors, it's not a civilian police operation. There will be, I think, 37 in the first group of 100. And when you look at the group of 600 of active and standby combined, those numbers go up proportionately. So it will be between 35 and 40% of the 600 group.
Great. Thank you. Yes, there in the back.
I don't have a marine voice.
We have a microphone for you.
Hi, I'm Brian Zolkowski from Mercy Corps, and I just wanted to pick up on the point that Ms. Mendelsohn Foreman made. And I too have been in a lot of these discussions, and there's a lot of deep, profound understanding of what the problems are. And to echo what she said, we just haven't figured out how to do things. And to echo the point about there being a lot of other actors with whom the U.S. government can and should be working. There's a lot of capacity out there. I mean, you often hear people say, well, you know, there just is nobody there to do this work in insecure environments. And I do work for an NGO that works in Afghanistan, has worked in Iraq since the beginning of the conflict, Colombia, Sudan. This is not an advertisement for NGOs, by the way, but there are a lot of NGOs, both international and national, as well as civil society in these societies, who are not actually maximizing very well. And if you take a place like Afghanistan, there is a role for each actor. We're just doing an incredibly bad job of identifying what that role is, funding and supporting that role in each of these very, very difficult situations. We have a tendency to think that we have to do it all, and that's not just a tendency of the military or the U.S. government or even international NGOs. So I guess to reiterate what Ms. Foreman was saying, there is a lot of capacity out there, and we really need to, as a government and a country, figure out how to play better in the sandbox and then identify what really needs to be done and identify the actors who can do it in each place. Last example. I said we were in Iraq since the beginning. We've also been in Helmand since 1986. The space for NGOs in a lot of these conflicts has shrunk. But by working with the communities, you can actually get materiel and assistance into those very, very difficult places and build from the ground up rather than necessarily always trying to do everything from the top down by ourselves.
Thank you. Yes, over here.
Major David Track. It's my Air Force voice. I was very pleased by General Cardon's comment about legitimacy, and I think we need to expand upon that idea. I think the United States, for the past several years, talked a lot about the rule of law and importing the rule of law abroad while systematically eroding the rule of law domestically. And I think that really cost us legitimacy overseas in our efforts to import the rule of law. So I was wondering, for some people who have been there, whether this perception that I have is reality-based. Have you encountered resistance to Americans telling anybody else how to do anything, or did they throw back in your face, well, but you don't follow the Geneva Conventions, you don't follow, you invaded our country on an illegitimate pretext and so forth, you do secret things, you don't follow the Constitution. How has that undermined our rule of law efforts abroad?
Anyone want to take that one on?
Whole nother panel.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm going to answer that a couple different ways. One, I'll just give you a very quick story. In 2003, this had more to do with influencing my thinking for the 5 years. He said, Colonel, you know how you survive an occupation? I said, well, you're not occupied. He goes, you're here, aren't you? He goes, here's how you survive. I have to be on the winning side. So members of my family are going to be in the police, army, politics, business, and the insurgency. So here's my question to you, Colonel. Are you leaving or staying? Because I got to know, so I can make decisions, which I couldn't answer in January or July of 2003, because our policy then was we're leaving, but everybody could see it was already starting to deteriorate, and I was in Fallujah, Iraq at the time. So that's one piece. The second piece is when you are in the when we came back 2007 down in these areas that are hardcore Al-Qaeda sanctuaries, these kind of rule of law, the rule of law they're used to is Al-Qaeda rule of law. You know, we'll cut your head off and leave you out in the street, your body. And so when you showed up and the first question they asked, are you staying or leaving? We got to know. And if you're going to stay, then we'll help you. But if you're leaving, like has happened here numerous times, clear, hold, build, we're real good at the clear, start to hold, then we pull back. which we've done in numerous places, southern Baghdad, Fallujah, other places, we got to know. And then this time, there was this sense that we were going to stay, and I think that had a lot to do. Once they got over that initial fear, then I think the whole perception on American military power changed. Before that, it was seen, you drive in, you drive out. Now we're living inside the population. And so I didn't see that. The greatest thing that hurt us in Iraq, and this is a travesty and cost American lives, was the Abu Ghraib scandal. And you heard that, you heard the insurgents say it turned people against us. People were doing things against us just because of what happened. And that goes to the character of the leadership in our soldiers, airmen, all components, and that could be civilians as well. So I mean, we got to watch that in the future, and that's a whole other area I won't go into here, but I'll just leave that answer.
I can certainly say, both in my democratic development work and on the Hill, that I have had thrown back in my face plenty of times from countries that we are in no position to lecture on democracy and human rights, and I think that's a tragedy, because our moral authority on that issue, I thought, was one of the strengths of our international diplomacy, and we have to rebuild that. Some of it was unfair, but it was used nonetheless.
I think one interesting feature that has come out of a lot of this, and it didn't only start in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it started before, was a greater use of anthropological information and in trying to understand different tribal legal systems and trying to understand ways of dispute resolution, to the point where I was recently with a young British anthropologist who just got his doctorate at the University of Edinburgh, and I said, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm going to join the military in 3 months. They're doing my security clearance. I'm going to be working in the British military as an anthropologist, precisely to help develop means of access to different cultures." I also think, obviously we've gone through a terrible time and a delegitimization of American values based on some of the most tragic events in our lifetimes in the rule of law. But on the other hand, I think what we can take out of it is the sensitivity we're going to need in the future in working with any of these cultures that are not Western, that are not following our ideals or our modalities, but nevertheless have ways to resolve a dispute. And we learned this as early as the post-Rwanda situation, and I think we continue to learn. But, one thing that we should do is make sure, like my colleagues in the United Kingdom, that we put more and more anthropologists into our teams to be able to understand what they're seeing on the ground.
Yes, sir.
Very, very thoughtful panel. I've come to a lot of these kinds of things, and this is really a very thoughtful panel. I think we all philosophically agree that civilians should be the face of a reconstruction effort. But are we a little bit and I've written that myself for a lot of U.S. domestic reasons, I think it's important. But are we a little bit mirror imaging? Because in the real world, I found that in some societies, unless they hear from a general of the most powerful military in the world that civilian control of the military is important, they're not going to believe it. And then kind of a related problem that I've seen, and maybe some of the folks here have seen something different, but you go to the AOR and you see a lot of the civilians who are sent over there they costume themselves in what looks like a military uniform. They insist on having a weapon even when their capabilities with that weapon are more a threat to themselves and others. And we have some tragic real-world examples of that. And so how are we going to make sure that this 100-person group is going to be organized, trained, and equipped and culturally adept and actually get on the airplane and go to that place? Because my first experience was with Somalia. I remember going to Mogadishu one time in the C-130. There were a bunch of NGOs. They were NGOs. They weren't U.S. government people. They got off that airplane. They looked around. They got back on that airplane. Because it is a very difficult thing. And in fairness to civilians, that's a different culture. So how do we address those pieces of the problem to make sure that we really can do this transition that I think we all support?
No.
In my dream world, there would be some form of a boot camp for the civilians who have to go through the CRS. I think hopefully it won't be just my dream world. I think it's essential. They need slightly different training. I mean, I grew up shooting .22s, and I learned you don't shoot them at a bear. I grew up in Alaska. 22 doesn't do much good in Iraq either. The civilians might not need to carry weapons, but they certainly need to know evasion techniques. They need to know self-defense. They need to know some basics about how to deal with themselves in that kind of situation. And I think as we stand up the civilian face, I don't care if you do work for the Department of Agriculture, you should go through a 6-week or 8-week or multi-month training to make yourself less of a liability in that kind of situation.
I think just to tap on that real quick, in the military, we can do a lot of things because we can, not because we have to. In other words, I have complete freedom of movement. I have patrols, I have helicopters, I can go anywhere, do anything. We can't get in there, we can force our way in. You know, the civilian capacity doesn't happen. And so it's easy for us to say, oh, I'm going to go meet with the governor, and there might be a little problem, and I just go. And when we got there, and Wade can back me up on there, back there, one of the PRT leaders that was with us in Iraq for Wasat Province, but I wouldn't meet with the governors without the PRT leader present, and then I tried to speak as little as possible. Even though they would defer because I was a general officer, it was about sharing your power. And those PRT leaders became immensely powerful. I think Wade did a lot of great work down there as a result. But I think it's things like that, because we as military are action people. And I think that's our culture.
Some of the best programs I've seen are when civilians and military leaders go in together and show the dynamic in front of these countries. It's exactly what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight there is frankly a very good program in the Netherlands. That's okay. I've worked with Marines. I can even speak Kruger. You can't hear me. But there is a very good program, and we Americans don't always do it the best way. But there's a Royal Dutch Army School for Peace Missions in Amersfoort that I've worked with in the past. This is an Army organization, but they are tasked not only with training military people who are going into peace missions, but they're also tasked with training government civilians and NGOs and even civilians. And so I know I've mentioned this to Larry Sampler at State CRS before. This is the kind of example that we need to take a look at. And frankly, our military could do a lot of this. A lot of these people can be very prepared to deal in those kinds of mission areas. The other thing, one of the things I just got done talking with the J5 at Pacific Command. He's very now concerned, he's a Marine, but he's very concerned with Sri Lanka. And he'd like to see programs that are going on in southern Mindanao right now be replicated in Sri Lanka because they've been so incredibly successful. Well, one of the things that he may be putting together to try to help get all the agencies working on the same sheet of music is, instead of putting together a war game, why not a peace game? Why not trying to use the methodology of war games and map axes and try to scope out, okay, how are we going to try to assist in a post-conflict area like Sri Lanka?
Jan Jeffrey, State Department, INL again. Thank you very much. I think it's these kinds of discussions that can make us, as a country and as a government, do this better in the future. I wouldn't take as bleak of a view of our ability to do this, perhaps, has been presented here, though. There is one other pretty important authority that the U.S. government has, the State Department in particular, for doing police programs and criminal justice programs overseas. It comes under the International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement account, which gives my bureau several $1 billion a year, which we provide in funding to Department of Justice, as well as to other organizations, USIP, ABA CLE. We also use our own contractors. And we currently have about 2,000, slightly fewer, U.S. police officers and criminal justice experts deployed around the world, including under UN missions in the European Union and Kosovo. So I think there's there's a lot we can do to improve coordination, planning in advance. Funding may be an issue also, but we do have the ability to bring very important resources that are available here in our country to other countries in post-conflict situations. Also on the issue of arming, some of our police officers do need to be armed overseas. For example, in southern Afghanistan, we have military civilian units that are taking part in a program that was developed in 2007 called Focus District Development. And these are squad-sized units that go out into the countryside and basically serve as police mentoring units. And our advisors are armed, and we believe that's probably appropriate given the environment. Thank you.
Yes, right in the center.
Andrea Krasnow, officer, military relations. Thank you. Civilian, so I don't have a loud voice. When we talk about rule of law, we've talked about institutions and people training judges, lawyers, even police officers. And these are groups of people who, in the countries we're talking about now, and maybe everywhere, are considered somewhat of an elite group. And I'm wondering what sort of pushback these programs get from the general population, whether the people you're training, police officers maybe are considered less elite than the others, but whether the people who are being trained are seen as just people supporting Americans, part of the occupiers, and what you can do through both military and civilian organizations to get the real local civilian buy-in from those programs, when what we are doing, it seems, is training from the top down.
Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I think your question is an important one about involving the community, if I understand it. And a lot of the community involvement really has to do with timing and sequencing of how this assistance is given. By the way, one of the exceptions, and the best exceptions to the 660 legislation, is precisely for community policing activities, which came out of events in Panama when they began to use access to citizens and civilians groups. But the face that most civilians who are the clients in these countries will see at the beginning will be military faces, which brings all the more important reason to have adequate training and connections to civilian groups, so that, as the general said, he always went in with a civilian counterpart or an NGO. Training of elites is important because you need to bring in people who are going to be part of the process of, basically forming the new technocracy of a country. But you have to also consider that you have to have top-down and bottom-up programs. And I think over the years, AID has gone back and forth about where you start in these programs. I think one of the experiences out of Afghanistan and Iraq is they're not mutually exclusive, and that you need to do both simultaneously. And the challenge is, and it's not to berate organizations, it's just very, very hard when you're working in very insecure areas, which is why I said previously that the need for some cultural sensitivity from anthropological understanding as to what policing is in these communities is very important. Good example, Haiti is for the most part a very Pacific country. Although you read about violence in Port-au-Prince and one or two other cities, the country is pretty much a self-policing situation because for hundreds of years that's all there were in these communities. There were community leaders and they had justice. It may not have been the justice we liked, but there was a system of justice. And I think we tend to forget that there are community justice principles, which we often don't see because we're not trained in those areas. And that's where I think it's the disrespect of these principles that creates the problems rather than the absence of them.
That's just a two-finger on that. I have a couple of different comments on it. One is that most people recognize the rule of law by its absence. When it's present, they don't really want to deal with it. And much like most of us, the vast majority of people worldwide don't want to deal with legal apparatus and legal issues. If you have to go to court, if you have to deal with a policeman, something's gone wrong in your life. And so you're trying to create a system that takes care of things so people don't have to deal with it. And that's necessarily an awkward activity to involve citizens in. They don't want to be involved in it necessarily. I think there's breakdowns within those groups. Lots of judges certainly think they outrank police and don't necessarily, I think Phil Carter was saying earlier about the judge not wanting to speak to the police. And you would see that in our country as well sometimes. Certainly in other countries that have more hierarchical systems, there's a big break between those two groups. The final thing I would say, though, is that it is important to involve citizens because it is a relationship between citizens and the state that you're rebuilding. And here, the most innovative project that I've seen is called the Culture of Lawfulness Project that I know gets funding from the State Department. And they're in Iraq. I worked with them in Colombia. They work from two levels. They train police in culture of lawfulness, rule of law, human rights. They also work with school children. And the idea is that in societies where there's a lot of gang activity or organized crime activity, you need the kids to start pushing upward on the idea that that's not where you want your society to go. And they got the model from Sicily, where it was one of the things that helped break the mafia to some extent in Sicily. So a little bit of a hodgepodge.
I think we have time for one more question, and the gentleman in the back has been waiting patiently, so you go ahead, and then we'll wrap it up.
My name is Hank Nichols. I'm from the Army Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, and I have two questions. One, as we build up these large bodies of security forces, do we have any long-term thoughts about what happens as the country becomes more stable and we have so many security forces in the country with time on their hands? We have a plan to occupy them at some later date? Occupy their time at a later date. And my other question is, do we think about the sustainability? Can Afghanistan's budget sustain these large security forces that we're building? Can they? I think their tax revenues cover 8 to 10% of all the state expenditures. So, how will these things be sustained into the future?
Great. I'd like to give each of the panelists a chance to respond to this question and also to make any final comments they'd like to make, and then we'll wrap it up. So in whatever order you wish to go.
Maybe last should go first to put me on the spot. Your question's very important on the sustainability question, because I think that's the gorilla in the room, basically. How do you sustain forces that can't, where there's no tax revenue or no base, where these are recurring costs, whether they be pensions for retired officers or basically daily operation? I think that's one of the reasons why the general talked about we need jobs, we need revenue bases, you need to develop resources. But I think the sustainability is also a function of stability. If there is no security or no stability, the ability to attract people to go into business in many of these places doesn't exist. And so sustainability is really a function of two factors. One, the ability to get the economy going, which requires a secure environment, and second, the ability to create the governance structures that provide the basis for developing all kinds of tax supports to ensure that a government can work. And finally, it requires a global stable economy so that in countries where they rely a lot on remittances and where income can be generated, that money is sent back to these countries. And I think that's one of the big, sad stories of this economic crisis, is that globally it's affected in the remittances that get sent back to a country.
I think it's a great closing question. In most of the countries where I've worked, police have been a drain on the society or predatory upon the society rather than helpful to the society. And when I was working on definitions of the rule of law, the smartest feedback I got from anyone was from someone much wiser than me who said, all this theoretical stuff is not particularly useful. You can know when you've got the rule of law because in a country with the rule of law, parents tell their kids to look for a policeman if they're lost. And in countries without the rule of law, they say anything but. So finding a way to make sure that you've got the right number of police to patrol and the right amount of law enforcement and so on, and not so much that it becomes predatory, is a huge issue. But I think that has a lot less to do with money, even wages that you pay to your police, and much more to do with the institutional culture of the police. There's lots of studies on this, but frankly, there's never enough money. Most people think that they've never got enough money. There's always room for corruption. That gets held back more by culture than by wages themselves. So I'd look at both sides of that.
I don't have the long-term answer for a place like Iraq or Afghanistan. I can recall a time at NDI when there were a number of small countries that we worked on. I won't mention who, but they didn't have any natural threats, and we took them to Costa Rica to look at the model of just building a national police force that also did border patrol. They didn't have; these countries couldn't afford a full-time military, nor did they need one, and that was one alternative as well.
In terms of sustainability, I think it's first very fungible. I think that's already been addressed. And I think absolutely it's related to the culture. I mean, if you're in a culture where the police are respected, which is in a lot of places of the world, then there's an incentive to go there. But part of the surge that we talked about earlier, it was bottom-driven. I mean, we went out into these areas and it was very local, and then you recruited local security. Think about it that way. And then you work to get them accepted into the security apparatuses, so it's local people in local areas, which also helps you with the corruption. And so that's a different approach than we normally use. And I think the rest of the points have been covered.
Great. Well, I'd like to please join me in thanking this terrific panel. I hope you enjoyed it.